In this video, I'm going to show the Ubuntu and Ubuntu derivatives how to install and use the Ubuntu Mainline Kernel Installer. Now, if you don't know what a kernel is, don't panic or don't worry. I will provide a link below the video if you found this video on YouTube. And if you found the video on my website, then you should be able to read by the links that I have to understand what a kernel is. Now, for the most part, most Linux users will never have to change their kernel, and the reason I say that is when you install Linux, the kernel, you have a kernel for the long-term support, and eventually if you have the hardware enablement and stack enabled, then it will get the most stable kernel installed with your updates. In the most current version of Ubuntu, the long-term support enabled the hardware enablement stack by the default. But in a past video, I showed how you can enable the hardware enablement stack for Ubuntu 18.04 and the Ubuntu 20.04. And the reason I'm making this video is because not long ago, my Ubuntu got an update that also updated the kernel to 5.8, and it started getting a lot of screen tearing. And one of the ways that I had to fix it was to first change my kernel. And to do that, I could have done it with the command line, but instead I used a graphical user interface tool called the Ubuntu Mainline Kernel Installer. So for the most part, you're probably not going to have to change it, but if you do, using this utility or this tool makes it very simple. So let's first take a look at what it is, and then we'll take a look at what a kernel is. So if you don't understand, to give you a little bit of an idea of what a Linux kernel is. Now, if you're a Windows user, Windows also has a kernel, and it says what is a kernel. The definition is very similar, but they work different from Windows and Linux, and on the bottom of my website I have a comparison. But a Windows kernel is the key program that's crucial for Windows to function and also for Linux to function. The kernel is the first program to load after the bootloader. After loading, it controls and coordinates every other program and process. The kernel is the bridge between the user and the hardware. It translates user instructions for the hardware that connects to them. And then there's a block diagram explaining that here's the user. The kernel basically takes the information from the user and puts it in a computer language or code that the computer can use. So most people don't have to worry with the kernel. It's the programmers that normally have to worry about the kernel. Now, Linux, Red Hat, has a link, and I have it on my website that you can click here, and there's the quote that I took from it. The Linux kernel is the main component of the Linux operating system and is the core interface between the computer's hardware and its process. It communicates between the two, managing resource as efficiently as possible. So you can see the Windows definition and the Linux definition are almost identical, the same. Now, the Linux kernel does four main jobs. And number one is memory management. It keeps track of how much memory is used and stored and where. It also does the processing management that determines what processes can be used in the central processing unit, also known as the CPU, when and for how long. And the drivers. The Linux kernel contains a lot of drivers so that when you're installing Linux, you don't have to go out and find drivers to install them like you do on the older Windows system, Windows operating system. So it does have a lot of built-in drivers in the corner. So it acts as a mediator, interpreter between the hardware and the processes. And then the last job is system calls and security. It receives requests for services from the processes. So if you would like to read more about this information on a kernel from Red Hat, you can click the link that I have here that will take you to that web page. Now, here's some of the features, and I'm not going to read all of those. So what it does, those features are listed on the Red Hat, and you can go and understand that you can install these manually by locating the kernel, your mainline kernel, and they have some of the older ones way back all the way to the most current one. Now, you don't want to download and install the RC1s and RC2s and the RC, especially if it says don't use. These RCs are like beta users, you know, they're still in the development stage, and it's RC is a release candidate. So this is kind of like if you're thinking about beta software, stay away from these. Use the stable ones if you're going to upgrade. And these are the links that you can click onto. Like I installed the 5.10. So if I wanted to, I could go through here and download the information or the deb files that matches my system and install them one after another. But instead of doing that, this lets you click on the one you want to install, click install, and it does the work for you. And that's how simple it is. It's just a graphical user interface of installing a newer kernel. So to do that, you basically open up your terminal, you copy this PPA, just right click, copy, paste that into your terminal, press the enter return key, enter your password, update your repository. Now if you're using Ubuntu 18.04 or newer, you can kind of skip the step, but I put this on here so if someone's using something different, and then you can copy this command list of commands here that actually installs Mainline. Once that you get it installed, it should put it within your menus if you're using menus, like I'm using the traditional menu of Ubuntu Mate 20.04, so it puts it in System Tools because this is a system utility. And here it is at the bottom, the Ubuntu Mainline Kernel Installer. So let me click onto it. And while it's loading, as you can see, it's fetching the newest kernels and it will place them in a list. So it's downloading the information from the internet, and there they are. So the newest kernel, and since I've installed my the information on my web page, 5.11.3 was the newest version, and since then there are a newer version of a kernel. And as you can see, you can highlight each of these and it shows you the individual packages that you will be installing. Like you can see, there's 4 different deb packages that will install for 5.11. You can highlight over and see each of the files that it will be downloading and install them. And if you have this up for a while, you can click the refresh button to refresh the ones that you see here. Or if you go into the settings and make changes, you can refresh so that they will take effect. Now let's take a look at how to remove it if you've installed it. You leave your terminal open, or you go back and reopen your terminal and put in this list of commands, which is basically removing the repository that you added here, because if you're taking it off, you really don't need the repository added if this is the only program that's coming from that repository. Paste it into your terminal, press the enter return key, put your password in, and let it remove the PPA. And then you're just removing the program, but simply by copying this list of commands, sudo @remove mainline, and that would take the program off of your system. Now I used to use UKUU, but if you click on that, it will take you to their Get lab. As you can see, it's now read-only because it's archived. This has now become a paid version. So Mainline Ubuntu Kernel Installer, or the Ubuntu Mainline Kernel Installer, is just a fork of the free version of UKUU rather than going and paying for something that this will do for free. Now here's basically reasons why you would want to update your kernel. For security reasons, you know, if your older kernel has been compromised, updating a kernel will provide additional security to your system. And if you've got newer components, it will probably provide some stability to your system. It has new drivers in the newer kernels, so by updating your kernel, it will accommodate more newer products that you're purchasing at the store and hooking to your system. It overall increases the speed of a newer system, and it provides functions that's not found within the old kernel. So you'll notice that Linux is growing on the number of capabilities that it can do compared to the older versions of Linux. So those are some of the reasons why you would want to update your kernel. But if your system is working and you're not experiencing any problems, I don't recommend you to update your kernel. Don't go through here and just randomly pick on a kernel and hit install, because you can run into some problems, especially if you got an older system and the newer kernel no longer supports an older driver that may be in your old system. That can cause some trouble on your system. So be very careful about running this particular program. It's just because, like I said, I ran into a problem, and this has been a problem that's been around for a while. In 2019, as you can see, it says Intel graphics card did not detected on Ubuntu, and it reverted to the LLVM pipe, which is a software renderer, rather than using their graphics card, the GPU, the graphics processing unit. And they had a problem then, and other people offered ways of fixing that. Now, I'm not using the Intel graphics card on this system here. It is an older system. It's using an AMD card. But as you can see, this has been a problem before in Ubuntu. And I'm just showing you not how to fix that problem, but one of the first steps, which was to get a different kernel. And most people said revert back to the older kernel, which worked. Instead of going backwards compatibility, I wanted to go to another newer one that did support, that worked, so that way that as I hook newer devices to it, I'm not going backwards, I'm going forwards. So as you can see here, what my problem was is the OpenGL renderer used the LLVM pipe instead of using the GPU. And this was a problem that happened 3 months ago. And they say that it was fixed. And if you click here, it will take you to how they fixed a brightness problem on their computer. So it really didn't have a solution for me, but they have the same trouble that I did. It says that basically my hardware is recently, so I updated my kernel for better support and it fixed all my problems. So see, they said that upgrading fixed the problems. I upgraded and it didn't initially fix all the problems. What I had to do, and I'll show you a website in just a moment of how I fixed it, and later I can provide a fix for that, so I'm not combining two different topics in one video. But as you can see here, they're running Ubuntu 20.04, the long-term support 64-bit, and that's what I'm using. They had the AMD Rising. I'm using a Radeon AMD card too, not that particular card, and their graphics LLVM pipe was used rather than the graphics processing unit. So I had the same trouble. They fixed theirs just by changing the kernel. So that's what I had to do, and then I had to go and do this. Ubuntu getting rid of the LLVM pipe and installing open source drivers correctly. So I had to go through here. Now I don't have this on this particular page, but I can add it, and I will make another section explaining how I upgraded the kernel, and then I did the steps on this, and that fixed my problem. So as you can see here, sometimes changing out your kernel will fix problems, but not every time. Like for this particular individual, upgrading or changing the kernel did fix their problem, but that I had to change my kernel in order for me to fix my problem. So as you can see here, I ran the INXI space dash GX, capital G, little x. And as you can see here, I do have an AMD card, and it found that. There's the vendor, but look at the driver at the time. It didn't load a driver for that graphical processing unit, the GPU. The display, it's using the X11 server, and it knows that I'm using an ATI Radeon card, but it didn't set up my refresh rate or the speed right. I use a 60 Hertz card. It did find the resolution of 1920 by 1080, but as you can see here, the OpenGL renderer was the LLVM pipe. So after my upgrade and after I rebooted the system, I started noticing if I click any video file, it had major screen tearing on the videos that I will open, and if I open any browser, it had major screen tearing, and that's because it was using the software renderer rather than the actual driver for my video card. So what I did was I downloaded and installed Ubuntu Mainline Kernel Installer. Now this was the kernel at the time that it found. So when you click here, it will show you, in this particular instances, I'm running the newest, not the newest, but a newer kernel than what was installed at the time of my problem. When I clicked onto it and got information, it would show me this information right here. Or this is actually when I clicked onto it to install it. As you can see, it downloaded. So when you click the install button, and the install is not highlighted because this is installed, but when you click the install button, it will go out and download the files. Like if I downloaded this one, if I click the install, it would go out and download those files that you see in that little box, pop-up box, and then it would go through and install them just like you're installing within a terminal, and then it will have you to reboot your system. And then as you can see here, when it rebooted, it was running the newer kernel. So that's how easy it is. I could pick a kernel, hit install. The install is now here. I'm not going to because I do have my system running good, but you hit the install and it will look like what you see here. And then when you reboot, open up the Mainline Kernel Installer, it will show you what kernel is running. Now at the time, it had the 5.8. As you can see here, 5.8 was installed, 5.8 was installed. Now I don't want to delete these and remove them. If something were to happen and I would corrupt this kernel, these are the kernels that I can revert back to. Even though that's screen tearing, it will allow me to use my system to reinstall a newer kernel. So I do still have these installed on here, but this was the particular kernel that I started getting the screen tearing. So I really could remove that one and leave this one installed, so if I reverted back to it. But as you can see here, what I did was after I went through, did the steps after I updated my kernel, I did these steps on this website, and then I ran this command, and I can run it again to show you. here's the command INXI space dash forward capital G. As you can see here, this I have an AMD Radeon card, and since I'm comparing the same thing, let me go up where I had the problem and compare it. Here, as you can see, that it still found the AMD card, and now where it says driver NA, it now has the driver AMD GPU. So it is actually loading the AMD driver, and it's the open source driver for my video card. And so now it's detecting the OpenGL renderer is no longer the LLVM pipe, which is the software renderer. It now has the actual graphics driver for my video card that matches my video card. So now I don't get the screen tearing when I'm watching videos or within the actual videos on my computer or videos on browsers that I open. So this fixed my video card issues. And it also, I have a video camera connected to a USB port. That also messed up when I got the upgrade with the 5.8 kernel. And when I went to the newer kernel, I had to reload the driver for the camera, an open source driver, but then it started back working. So this kernel fixed two of my problems, and I had to upgrade the kernel before I could install the software. So if you are experiencing trouble on your system, it may not be the kernel. I would do the kernel as the last option. Now, before I do close out this video, here's what the settings looks like. Now, if I click on settings, let me minimize this so we're not looking at our background at the same time. Here are the buttons that you've got on it. If you go in here and make some changes, and by default, these notify if a major release is available. And if you leave these checked, if you install a kernel that's not the most current kernel at the top of the list, you'll get a notification every so often pop up saying that there's a newer version available. So I come in here and untick these. Now you can say hide the unstable releases, and I recommend that. The unstable ones are like the beta versions, the RC versions that I showed you on that website that will display here. To remove those options that are not stable, you check this, and that's checked by default. And then you can say skip internet connection check every so often. I don't check that one. You hit OK, and if you've made changes, you hit the refresh the list, and it will go out, and like if you had the RC ones displayed, it will then hide them. It will update to match the settings changed. Now you can click on one, click the install. You can click on one and hit remove. Now the purge and remove is basically the same thing. The only difference is when you purge one, it will take it from the list, and it will remove not just that particular kernel, it will remove all the things associated with that kernel. So when you purge something, it removes it and removes the files associated with it. Whereas if I remove, and this is not installed, so I can't remove it. I can purge this from my list, but I can't remove it because it's not installed to remove from the system, but I can purge it from the list of kernels on this list. Which here, notice if I click on that, I can't remove it because it's currently running. I would have to go and install one, and then I could go back and remove this one that's no longer the active one. Like these are installed on my system. So watch, when I click onto it, I can either remove it or purge it. It will do very similar. Purging will remove it, and then it will take it out of the list and remove anything associated with it. Remove would just be like uninstalling it, and it may leave behind some files that was created from this particular kernel. Kind of think of clicking on this one in the remove button like standing on a rug. When you're standing on a rug, you can't reach down and pick up that rug because you're standing on it. So you can't remove a kernel that's actively running in the background. It has to be a kernel that's not running in the background, like standing on a separate smaller rug, reaching over, and then you can pick up the rug that you're not standing on. So these are like rugs you're not standing on, but they're installed, so I can remove them from the system to save space. So these are the buttons. They're pretty self-explanatory. These are some changes that you can make to a particular active kernel. You can come here and you can see some of the changes that were made from the previous version, and there's lots of changes made from the current one. And a lot of times this is mainly for programmers. A lot of the language to the average user won't make sense. So that button right there is really for programmers. You can look and read and try to help you understand a little bit more about the kernels. I've already showed you the settings, and then the about shows you what version you're using. It has a link to their GitHub website and shows you that it's basically a fork of the UKUU version. If you click this, it will give you more credits than what you see here. So this is basically how you change the kernel of your Ubuntu or Ubuntu derivative system. I hope this is useful to you, and have a great day.